welcome on behalf of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute. Tonight, the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, will speak to us about what the global economy needs. In 2010, Gordon Brown published a book titled Beyond the Crash, Overcoming the First Crisis of Globalisation, in which he set out his views on the global financial crisis that occurred between 2007 and 2010. In his book, he gives an in-depth analysis of how the financial collapse occurred, how it truly became not only a global crisis, but also the first financial and economic crisis in our modern era of globalization. Moreover, he offers in his book a passionate argument for creating globally coordinated structures for mending financial markets and creating jobs prosperity on a worldwide scale. While most of the text is written in the past tense, and the title of the book suggests that we are beyond the crash, Brown is very explicit that, and I cite, the crisis is not over. And these days, we are all very aware of the fact, namely that we are witnessing perhaps a second wave of financial turmoil that threatens the world economy. While Gordon Brown's book has much to offer in terms of financial, economic, and political insights, theoretical and historical insights, it also has a forceful moral message. Markets need morals. Brown's plea to underpin global markets with a globally shared sense of moral responsibility is especially relevant to this audience. Included in Brown's audience tonight are students of NYU Abu Dhabi. They come from more than 70 different countries and are engaged in a liberal arts education that aims at teaching, discussing, and researching moral leadership. It is thus with great pleasure and gratitude that Gordon Brown, NYU's own distinguished global leader in residence, has accepted our invitation to address our global community. After his lecture, he will respond to questions from Peter Henry, Dean of the Stern School of Business at NYU. Henry, who holds a PhD from MIT and taught international economics at Stanford, is currently Dean Richard West Professor of Business and William Berkeley Professor of Economics and Finance at NYU New York. After his conversation with Gordon Brown, our honorable speaker will take questions from the audience. Dr. Brown, the podium is yours.
Can I say, first of all, what a real privilege it is to be in Abu Dhabi, to be speaking to you this evening, and to be working with New York University. And I think the concept of a global network university, which New York University is pioneering for the world, is something that has got a huge, potentially transformative effect, not just here and in this region, but throughout the world. The idea that through a global university, people can connect with each other a great deal more easily. People from different countries, nationalities, religions, and values can communicate and discuss with each other some of the great global challenges we face. Makes me optimistic about the future of our world. And I want to congratulate all those, particularly President John Sexton, but everybody who has been involved in this great idea to create a global network university, and those here in Abu Dhabi who are making it a reality by what they're doing every day. Now, I do want to speak about the global economy, and I do want to suggest to you that we are at a momentous time of choice. I think a lot of people thought that we had a crisis in 2008 and 2009, and that we'd come out of this crisis and could plan for a return to normalcy for the future. But I think we're finding, not least because the epicenter of the crisis has moved from America to Europe, that we have a big choice to make. And we've got to make it, in my view, in the next few weeks and months. Either we can begin a new chapter of economic cooperation where continent to continent we work together to build global growth and global employment, or my fear is, and this is what my theme will be this evening, that we will retreat into a new protectionism where country will fight country rather than cooperate with each other to build a better global economy. And we can already see these signs of protectionism developing in different parts of the world. We saw only a few weeks ago that Switzerland had decided that it would protect its own currency from market pressures, and this has been followed in India, it's been followed in Korea, it's been followed in Indonesia, and to a certain extent in Japan. We saw a few weeks ago that Brazil decided that it would abandon its attempts to get a world trade deal and would impose its own tariffs on manufactured goods entering its country, and particularly on car imports from emerging markets, and it has begun a new wave of tariff protectionism that could spread to other parts of the world. We have this week, as you probably know, the American Senate discussing whether to name China as a currency manipulator, and in a slip of the tongue, President Obama actually referred to China as a currency manipulator only a few days ago. And at the same time, we have capital controls being imposed by a number of different countries around the world. And we have what I'll talk about in a minute, a new home bias, where banks are trying to protect themselves against the next wave of turmoil by retreating into the country in which they are located and liquidating many of their assets in other countries. So there is a real danger that we retreat into a new protectionism or mercantilism that would mean that the world, which has actually seen a globalization over the last 30 or 40 years, that has produced growth through trade, abandons that, and we retreat into something that does less good for the world's population. So I want to explain what I think is happening, and then try to suggest there is a way through this, and suggest particularly that the G20, which is meeting in France in November, in the first week of November, could make some quite historic decisions that would enhance cooperation and prevent what I fear could be a second world downturn over these next few years. Now, you may wonder why a politician has got anything to say now about the world economy, given the failures of politicians over the last few years to avoid the problems we face. I was at an IMF meeting a few months ago, and there were a series of demonstrators outside this IMF meeting, and there was a whole series of banners that people had put up as demonstrators protesting against what the IMF was doing. And there was one banner that really struck me, and I should mention to you this evening, because on this banner was a simple set of phrases: worldwide campaign against globalization. And you can understand what people were trying to say, that they were protesting against the way globalization was working. In France, the anti-globalization protesters actually did something in 2008 that reflected an even greater desperation about what was happening. They just said the banner was "No to 2009." And there is a popular pressure against what has actually been happening over the last few years, and a popular discontent that is reflected in the marchers from Spain, the indignant ones, to Brussels over the last few weeks, and also, of course, the people protesting in New York with the demonstrations in Wall Street. And politicians have not done well in this crisis. When I chaired the G20, which met in London in April 2009 to discuss the world economic crisis, and it was the first meeting of the G20 to discuss this as leaders of and heads of government. We'd had an initial meeting with George Bush in November 2008, but this was the first meeting to discuss what we would do to remedy the crisis. I started the meeting by reminding people of what had been said in the 1930s after the Great Crash. And I reminded them that Winston Churchill, who many of you will know was a predecessor of mine, Prime Minister of Britain, got an incredible reputation for his oratory and for many other things. He made a resolution late in life to change the one he had previously made. His original resolution was never to drink alcohol before lunchtime. And then he changed it late in life, and he decided here of a new resolution, and it was never to drink alcohol before breakfast. And Churchill, who said that politicians usually get things right after trying everything else, he actually said, and this was what he said about the 1930s, and the failure of leadership to deal with world economic problems that we all know led to a huge amount of protectionism and eventually to a breakup in the world economy and, of course, to even more disastrous consequences. He said of the time, famous quote, politicians, he said, had been resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence. And that was his comment on the failure of politicians to lead in the 1930s. And Keynes, who many of you know was a great economist who believed he had a solution to the problems of the 1930s, and who believed that the policies that were being pursued by governments were all wrong, he wrote a pamphlet, and this is exactly the position we're in at the moment. After 1929, the Great Crash, financial turmoil, an attempt to rectify it, and then there came another downturn, and Keynes wrote his pamphlet, How We Can Conquer Unemployment. And he sent it to the British government of the day, into the finance ministry, and the head of the finance ministry looked at this pamphlet, the great Keynes, telling us how economic policy should be run, and all the civil servant, the person who was in charge of the Treasury, could write on this pamphlet, and it's in the Treasury Library as proof of what he said, was only 3 words, and they're rather reminiscent to what people are saying today. Inflation, extravagance, bankruptcy. And so the views of Keynes that were to solve the problems of the 1930s were rejected, and people decided that his policy was too easily characterized as one that would lead to bankruptcy, i.e. debt, extravagance, i.e. profligacy in spending, and eventually to inflation, and were rejected. No wonder that Keynes talked about politics as the survival of the unfittest. These were his words. Rather reminiscent of what Shelley, the poet, and many people quote this about politicians of the time. Shelley had said of his mother-in-law, lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And perhaps that's how you might characterize a lot of political interventions of the day. And it was said of one British politician, which might actually be said of what's happening in Europe at the moment, never missed a chance, they said, to let slip an opportunity. And this may be the problem that we're facing. Now, what is happening now that requires the political leadership that I'm suggesting was missing in the 1930s? Let us start with the epicenter of the crisis now, which is Europe. And then let's look at what's happening to the world economy as a result of it. And then let's try to project into the future about what we may have to do if we're going to prevent a further downturn in the world economy. When people look at Europe, they think, here is a debt crisis. That's the word that is most famously used, a debt crisis. And then they look at Greece, and they say, Greece, profligacy, and rightly so, because Greece has never been able to collect taxes, has always overspent, has paid its public officials at levels it could never afford. When it joined the euro, we now know it gave fraudulent figures that ignored the fact that its whole defense budget was taken out of its public spending calculations when reporting to the European Union. And so people rightly say, here's Greece, a country going bankrupt. Here's the effect on the Eurozone. It is debt crisis right across the Eurozone. But someone might then ask, if Greece, which is only 2 to 3% of the European Union, could bring the whole of the Eurozone and the European Union to the brink, what is it that has gone so wrong? And they might conclude that perhaps the problem is not only Greece. Perhaps the turmoil we're seeing in Europe is certainly partly caused by what has been happening in Greece, but is not wholly caused by what is going on in Greece. And I think they will then discover, as we look at it in some detail, that there are 3 separate problems in Europe that if you don't deal with together, you will not be able to get out of the downturn that we are now, at least in Europe, already entered into. And the first problem in Europe is that we've still got a banking problem. We've still got a problem of the financial sector. In 2008 and 2009, it was the collapse of the subprime market in the United States and the reverberations in the financial systems, not just in America but worldwide, that brought the first economic recession because it caused a financial crash. And we discovered then that our banks were undercapitalized. We discovered that our financial system was far more fragile than we thought, that risk was being concentrated in a number of big global financial institutions that were entangled with each other, and that a shadow banking system had developed side by side with the formal banking system, which meant that we were in an even more risky situation than people imagined. In 2008 and 2009 in Britain and America, we recapitalized our banks. In 2008 and 2009, we wrote down the losses. In 2008 and 2009, we provided funding for our banks to allow them to get through the financial crisis. And as a result, the American and British banks are highly capitalized compared with what they were before the crash. But if you look at Europe, what actually happened after 2008, and I'll just explain to you because I was at a meeting of the Euro leaders in autumn, October 2008. And it was just after the Lehman banks had crashed. And it was as the market froze. And I went to a meeting of the Euro 16 it was at that time, and Britain was invited along, not because we were a member of a Euro, because we had refused to join, but because we'd already decided to restructure our banks. And the rest of Europe wanted to hear what we were doing to see whether it was worth following. And I went to that meeting, and at that meeting, the first thing that was clear was that nobody believed the crisis was anything other than an American crisis, perhaps an Anglo-Saxon crisis, America and Europe. People did not believe that the European banks had any real problems. They were surprised when I told them that half the subprime from America had been bought by European banks, who were actually in danger as a result of that. And even more astonished when I said that European banks were in greater danger because they were more weakly capitalized and they were more dependent on short-term funding from the wholesale markets. And right throughout the crisis from then, from 2008, Europe has not thought of itself as having a banking problem. And it's only in the last few weeks that people have realized what we were saying in 2008 and 2009, that European banks are far too heavily leveraged, over-leveraged. They're far too dependent on short-term finance. They are unable to lend properly to businesses across the European Union. And as they deleverage, they're going to put businesses at risk and, of course, cause lost output in the European Union. So Europe has a banking problem. The leverage of German banks is 32 to 1. In other words, their liabilities are 32 times their capital. Of French banks, it's 28 to 1. In America, it's roughly 10 to 1. The capital that these banks have in relation to the liabilities is very limited indeed. And unless the European banks recapitalize, then they will not be able to perform the proper function that they should exhibit in the financial system. Because the truth is that while they said they were going to recapitalize after 2008, they didn't do it. And while they said they were going to write down the debts, they didn't do enough of it. And now they're faced not only with a problem of not having enough equity, but they also have a funding problem getting their funds from the wholesale market. So Europe now has a banking crisis that has got to be resolved. One bank last week, Dexia, virtually went under and has had to be rescued by the Belgian and the French government. There are other banks that are in practice insolvent. If the European Central Bank were to withdraw their funding, if Europe doesn't deal with its banking crisis, then it cannot return to growth. And of course, the second problem in Europe is that not only because of the profligacy of Greece, but because of the problems that have been caused in the banking system, in Ireland and elsewhere, there is a huge fiscal problem now. So the fiscal problem in Portugal, in Spain, and in Ireland is partly the result of the banking problems and the follow-through where the state has had to come in and rescue these banks. But Europe's got a third problem, and this is why I want to talk about global issues and not simply Europe. Europe is not growing fast enough and hasn't been in recent years. And Europe is declining as a share of the world economy as the other major economies in Asia, Latin America, the emerging markets rise to prominence. So Europe, which was once 30 or 40% of the world economy, is now 18% of the world economy. It's going to fall again because naturally and quite realistically, you're going to see a further rise of this region and of Asia and of Latin America over the next few years. So at some point, relatively soon in the next 10 or 15 years, Europe will be maybe little more than 15% of the world economy, then 10% of the world economy. But it's facing a competitiveness crisis because it cannot grow fast enough, because it's not able to sell enough to the emerging markets. So the emerging markets, and I mean China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, Turkey, Mexico, are about 70 to 75% of the global growth that we're seeing. And this would include, of course, an even higher figure if we included this region as well. But only 7.5% of Europe's exports go to these regions. And therefore, in the fast-growing areas of the world, Europe is not securing enough export growth and enough penetration of these markets, and therefore it is retreating as a competitive power. So here you have three problems. You've got a banking problem, you've got a fiscal problem, and you've got a growth and competitiveness problem. And this has got to be solved within the euro. And the euro is the currency. Of course, there are 27 members of the European Union, but of course, there are 16 within the euro area. And to solve this problem within the euro area, you've got to recognize that you cannot, if you're Spain or Portugal or Ireland or Greece, or even if you're Germany or France, you cannot adjust your currency. You can't devalue. So you can't get competitiveness simply by allowing your currency to float downwards, as has happened for Britain, for example. You can also set your own interest rate, because you're in the single currency, so you cannot have a Spanish interest rate that is designed to attract borrowers or to make yourself more competitive. You can't create your own money supply. You can't do what Ben Bernanke did. You can't do what the Bank of England has done. Only the European Central Bank can pump money into the economy, can actually create the new liquidity, the new money supply that's necessary. And you can't run excessive deficits because that's the rules of the European Union. So within this euro area, as Spain and Portugal and Ireland and Italy face up to the problems, they can't do the things that America can do, or Britain can do, or Australia can do, or any of the other major powers in the world economy, in the emerging markets can do. Can't devalue, can't create your own money supply, can't set your own interest rate, can't actually run excessive deficits. And you don't have what the American single currency has, which is, of course, the flexibility that comes from great labor mobility across America, from wage flexibility that is there in America, and most of all, perhaps, from the ability of the central government, the federal government, to spend 20% of the nation's resources as public money, which it can put into Massachusetts or California or Arizona or Arkansas or whatever, whenever there's a problem there. It can vary the money it puts to different states to enable them to come out of a recession. So the European Union spends only 1% of the European GDP, where the American federal government spends 20% of GDP. So Europe has got a problem about how it responds to this crisis, as well as the crisis problems themselves. And its lack of room for maneuver is what is creating perhaps people's greatest worries about the future. So I've got no doubt that if we're going to solve the European problem, we've got to make sure we recapitalize the banks quickly. We've got to provide the funding that is necessary so that these countries that are in difficulty are not pushed around by the markets every few minutes and can survive and therefore be in a position to start to grow again. But we've got to have a growth strategy for the world economy. Because if Europe can't grow and America's growing slowly, then the effect will be on China and India and Asia, who will eventually find that their exports to Europe and America are affected, and the world will start to grow at a slower rate. And everybody saw in 2008 just how quickly a problem in one continent affected another continent. Now, what's the problem we've got in the world economy? The problem we've got in the world economy is everybody has got their own solution to the world economy's problems and their own problems, and it's exactly the same for them. Each country at the moment wants to export their way out of difficulty. So China's strategy is exports. The rest of Asia, from Korea to Indonesia, they plan to build their prosperity around exports. Brazil wants to export to the rest of the world. Turkey wants to export to the rest of the world. The new emerging economies in Africa want to export to the rest of the world. Everybody wants to export to the rest of the world, but so too now does America. America, constrained by lack of consumer spending in America, constrained by lack of public investment funds because of the deficit, its future depends on exporting to the rest of the world and gaining competitive strength from doing so. Britain wants to export its way forward. The rest of Europe wants to follow Germany in exporting its way forward. It follows that if everybody pursued their own strategy without talking to each other, then everybody is trying to do exactly the same thing, but of course not everybody can export their way to success because someone has got to import goods. And that is the problem that the world economy faces. So here we are in 2011, 3 years after the financial crisis. Europe actually now the epicenter of the problem, a banking problem, a financial problem, and a growth problem, a competitive problem, all having to be solved within the euro, and Europe and America and the rest of the world with no agreement about how we can move forward. We've got no trade agreement, we've got no global growth agreement, we couldn't get a climate change agreement, we don't have an agreement on the standards for the financial system because each region is doing its own thing now. How can we solve this problem? And this is where I want to conclude my remarks before questions. The world economy is at a very critical juncture. 10 years ago, America, as the world's majority producer and majority consumer, could drive the world economy forward. And if America decided it was going to grow, it could both grow and drive the rest of the world economy. 10 to 15 years from now, China, Asia, and the emerging markets will be able to drive the world economy forward. But we're at a point of transition at the moment. For 150 years of the Industrial Revolution until around 2010, Europe and America together were the world's majority producer. They produced most of the world's output. They were the biggest exporter. Together, they had the majority of the world's investment. Together, they produced the majority of the world's manufactured goods. And of course, they were the world's majority consumer as well. So this small group of people compared with the world's population, Europe and America, 800 or so million people, out of the 7 billion we now think of the population of the world, just over 10% of the world was responsible for 50% of the output and more than 50% of manufacturing and more than 50% of investment. Since 2000, but particularly since the crisis of 2008, Europe and America don't anymore produce the majority of the world's goods. They don't produce the majority of the world's exports. They don't produce the majority of the world's manufactures. They don't produce the majority of the world's investment. Only 40% of the world's output comes from the EU 27 and from America. Only 41% of the world's manufacturing, only 41% of the world's investment come from Europe and America, where it used to be way over 50%. But Europe and America still consume the vast majority of the world's goods and services. It was 60%, it is now 55%. So you produce 40% of the world's goods, but you consume 55% of the world's goods and services. And this is where the mutual dependence of Europe and America, the West, and the rest of the world arises. Maybe 10 years from now it'll be different. 10 years ago it was different. Because even although America and Europe were the world's majority consumers, they were also the world's majority producers. But today, we're in a mutually dependent relationship. The majority consumer is not the majority producer, and the majority producer is not the majority consumer, and we rise or fall together and are mutually dependent upon each other. And it seems to me that there is no easy way out of this crisis other than through cooperation. If we retreat into protectionism, America and Europe will have to cut their consumer spending dramatically. If, however, we cooperate, it is possible to envisage a situation where we can all benefit from higher levels of growth. If China was able to consume more, which is its policy, and open its markets to more goods coming from other countries, if India was able to open its markets, if the rest of Asia was able to consume more, If at the same time America and Europe, while cutting their deficits, were able to invest in their infrastructure, then you could have a mutually reinforcing global growth pact. Both parts of the world and all continents contributing to world growth. So my proposal is to deal with what is this unique situation in the world, where you now have a crisis in Europe, but you also have a lack of faith in the ability of the world to create sustainable growth because of the changing relationships between East and West and North and South. My proposal is that the G20 get together, that they decide that they will look at how they can grow in coordination, that China is persuaded that it should increase its consumption faster. In return, the West will increase its investment in infrastructure faster, so that we can have this confidence that America and Europe can export to the rest of the world at the same time that China knows that America and Europe will be recovering and will be growing, and therefore its export market is not as at risk as it is today. And that is a way in which we can start to see highly effective policies for more sustained global growth. Now, I believe that you could then talk about a trade deal. You've got to deal with inflation problems. There are clearly issues about the currencies that we know we've got to deal with, and equally, of course, there are issues about inflation in China in particular. But all these problems can be dealt with in the context of a growing world economy, one that is growing faster than now, but one where people are more confident about the growth that can come in the future. I said that we're at a very important juncture in world history because we have this changing relationship between East and West. And we're also at a very important juncture in people's faith in the ability of decision makers to get things right. And I believe, as I've said, that if you can't get this right by a coordinated policy for growth, then you will have a disintegration of cooperation and the threat of protectionist policies, which I talked about at the beginning. I personally am very optimistic about the future because I believe that people will see that there is an ability to grow within the world. There is no shortage of savings. There are infrastructure needs that require to be met. There is not a huge inflation problem that has to be addressed, and therefore the potential for growth exists. In the 19th century, in Britain, we had a famous poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and many of you may have heard of his poetry, and indeed his poetry has become the motto for the Olympic Games that will be held in London in 2012. To seek, to strive, to find, and not to yield. This great poem about the potential of human beings to rise above their circumstances and to achieve great things, which of course is an ideal way of thinking about an Olympic Games where people are stretching themselves to the limit. But Alfred Lord Tennyson became very pessimistic about the future in the later years of his life. And he had written a poem called Locksley Hall, and then wrote another poem called Locksley Hall 60 Years On. And his poem reminds me of some of the words that we're seeing now when people talk about the world economy. Because his poem was, O cosmos chaos, O chaos cosmos, where will it all end? And here was Tennyson reflecting with pessimism about his hopes for how the world was going to develop in the future. And the Prime Minister of Britain at the time was called Gladstone. And Gladstone was a friend of Tennyson and was quite shocked by Tennyson writing about such pessimistic views, with such pessimistic views of the world. So unusually for a Prime Minister or any politician, he wrote to a literary magazine to criticize Tennyson's poetry. And he said, why does Tennyson not understand, and this is relevant to today, how great the progress has been made over the last 50 years? And how things that we thought were never possible, like taking people out of poverty, getting people into healthcare, getting people education, things that were achieved for Britain in the 19th century and are being achieved around the world in the last 20 and 30 years of globalization were happening. And he said, why doesn't he remember his first poem, Locksley Hall, which is not Locksley Hall 60 Years On, but Locksley Hall. And he reminded Tennyson that his words were dipped into the future as far as the eye could see, saw a vision of the world and the wonder it could be. So here was Gladstone telling Tennyson, don't be so pessimistic by looking simply at what is happening at the moment. Take a long view and be optimistic about the future of the world. I end with that famous poem that was written by a great American, Robert Frost, and you may know The Road Not Taken, which is thought of as a poem about people's personal destiny and how they make big decisions about the future. Two roads diverged in a wood. I took the road less traveled by, and it made all the difference. And this is a poem that is rightly, I think, thought to be a poem about personal destiny, about people making big decisions, about turning points that people reach. They come to a point where they've got to make a choice between one road or the other, and they make a historic choice that takes them in a direction that makes all the difference. And when Robert Frost wrote this poem, amazingly, people who said, this is a great poem of destiny, found Robert Frost saying, I didn't mean it that way at all. He said, I actually meant that you could have taken either road, and to be honest, no one was more significant than the other. And he said, look, if you read it carefully, I actually say that both paths were equally sound. And how am I to judge? If you'd taken the other road, it could have made all the difference as well. And he tried to sort of wish away all the sort of gravitas that was being thought of as arising from his poem. And then one of his friends, who was called Edward Thomas, who was also a poet, had to make a huge decision, because it was during the First World War, and they were deciding who was going to serve, who was going to volunteer to serve in the Allied forces that went into Europe during the First World War. And this guy, Edward Thomas, read Robert Frost's poem and immediately decided that this was a call to destiny, and he had to go and serve in the First World War. And instead of leaving for America, which he had thought he might do, and joining Robert Frost and his family, he decided that he would volunteer for the war, and tragically, in his first days of fighting, he died. And this changed Robert Frost's view of his own point. He could see that it had an influence on people. And I think this is where we are at the moment in a real sense. We know that the world can go in one direction or another. We can take this road of cooperation, but it's very difficult because we're up against nationalist, protectionist, mercantilist pressures, where it's easier for people to retreat into the national silos. It's easier for people to think, what can I do in my country, as opposed to what can we do by coordinating our action? Or we can take the more difficult road. And the more difficult road is to cooperate and to work together to try to find a coordinated solution. Some people having to bury their preconceived ideas that they're going to export their way without any thought of what's happening in other countries to a solution to the problems. And I think we are at this point of choice. And I think if Robert Frost was looking at us, he would say that this is an example of where destiny calls. We can make this choice of cooperation, but if we descend into protectionism, we move backwards in a way that the world economy is retreating from globalization and all the benefits that is given. I believe that it's our duty in the next few months to put the case for coordinated action around the world, to deal with the problems of a global financial system that has not yet been properly reformed, to make sure that we can coordinate our actions so that we can make sure also that there is sufficient growth and employment in the world economy in a period when it is possible to imagine us using the resources that are available to us more effectively. And I believe there is no better place to send out that message than from this great global network university, the New York University, that the way forward is cooperation. Coordinating our efforts will make a difference. We can actually be optimistic, as Gladstone was, about the future, and we can make a decisive choice that we favor cooperation in favor of disintegration. I think that these are the issues that we should be dealing with in the world economy at the moment, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Gordon, thank you very much for those insightful and indeed optimistic remarks. I want to explore, if we might, for a few minutes, some of the themes that you've touched on. And as a student of history, as a scholar of history, you have a PhD in history, I want to start with a bit of history, actually. So I think that history will show you in a tremendous light. You talked about forks in the road. There are two decisions that you were the driving force behind. First of which was the decision by Britain not to join the euro, which I think is standing Britain in great stead these days. I think all of Britain owes you a gratitude of debt for that. But then also the decision to recapitalize the banks in Britain when that was not the route that most of the world was going. Those are two very courageous decisions. And so as a student of history, on the one hand you can say, history are a series of lessons from the past so that we can make better decisions in the future. There's another view of history, which in sort of colloquial American English is to say that history is just one doggone thing after another. And looking at the world right now, it seems as though many of the leaders around the world have forgotten some of the lessons that you lay out so clearly in your book and so clearly in some of the decisions you made as Chancellor of the Exchequer and as Prime Minister. Talk to us for a minute about that perspective of why are we not learning from history, or am I being too uncharitable to the current world leaders?
I think it's too easy for us to retreat into these national silos. So the minute there's a crisis and there's an urgency, people are prepared to come together. So for years we'd thought, can we create a better forum for world cooperation than what was called the G8, or simply the IMF or the World Bank? Can we create a meeting that included China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the new powers that are on the landscape? And only when we had the urgency of a crisis did people agree, let's form the G20, let's form a new organization, because you can't solve this crisis without involving China, India, Brazil, and all these other countries. So there's a sense, I think, that you're really pointing to. It's only when things get absolutely desperate that people begin to come together and act. And perhaps what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is that since the original crisis, there has been a sense of complacency about our ability to get through the next stage. And I think it's probably only in the last 2 weeks that people have come to see that the gravity of the situation in Europe affects not just Europe, but affects the rest of the world. So I think the, if you like, the desperation, the urgency that comes from desperation, I think is what sometimes makes people do things that otherwise they would not do. I think secondly, it is really, really difficult to persuade people to look beyond the national interest. I mean, it's very interesting. I was in America a few days ago and always enjoy my stays in America. But if I'm right, the solution for America to its low rate of growth and high level of unemployment at the moment does not lie in this internecine debate that is taking place at the moment over the deficit alone. That America needs to export to the rest of the world. And America's got massive technology. It's got huge intellectual firepower. It's got some of the products that people in China, Asia are desperate to buy because the inventive skills are in America. But America's debate is not about how it can export to the rest of the world and build up its economic strength and show that it can balance its high levels of consumer spending in America with a high level of success in exporting to the rest of the world. The debate in America is purely about what happens within America between deficit reduction and stimulus, between tax cuts or spending rises or spending cuts and tax rises. That is the debate that's taking place. So America has, in a sense, retreated into this national silo and is debating issues that are domestically of great political controversy, but perhaps not the main change that needs to be made if America is going to actually be economically powerful 5 years from now, 10 years from now, as it should be. And therefore, it is a lot easier for people just to talk about the deficit than to talk about trade deals, or to talk about resisting protectionism, or to even confront the argument that you need higher levels of trade, which may mean that you've got to accept imports if you're going to be able to export to the rest of the world. So this cooperation is very, very difficult when the debate retreats, or the talk of the debate retreats into national silos. And I suppose the last point I'd make is, do people recognize now what was never true, and therefore history can't really teach us much about this, that there is now such a thing as a global problem in the sense that it can only be solved by global action. If I'm right, you're not going to have financial stability that is sustainable unless you have some form of global financial supervision, and not just national regulatory authorities, but some form of global financial supervision. If I'm right, of course, then climate change, which cannot be addressed simply by one nation making a few decisions, requires greater international cooperation. And if I'm right, therefore, there are global problems that actually you don't have an option to cooperate. You've got to cooperate if you're actually going to solve these problems. So on the first two issues I'm raising about governments retreating into the national silos and urgency, you can learn a lot of lessons from history, that you should act more quickly and that you should not be too protectionist. But on the third, which I think is becoming a uniquely sort of distinctive characteristic of this generation, that we now have something you can categorize as not a common problem or just a shared problem, but a global problem, only solvable if you have a globally coordinated solution, then there's not much in history that can teach us about how we deal with that. We've got to learn from the fact that we now have a global economy, that there are global flows of capital, global sourcing of goods. Here we are in a region that is building up contacts with the rest of the world. Here we are with an internet where you can communicate instantaneously at a global level with people in any part of the world. Are we prepared to recognize this is a new era in which we have to look for new ways of working together?
So let's take your theme of national silos and move from America to Europe. I'm sure everybody's wondering what your thoughts are about Europe. So perhaps even as we speak, Chancellor Merkel, President Sarkozy are supposed to be meeting today to talk about solutions with the banks. And yet we have a situation in which, as you say, if we don't learn very quickly indeed, probably in the next couple of weeks, we could be facing a very, very serious situation going forward. And yet, if you look at the situation in the Eurozone, Germany, for instance, has been one of the largest beneficiaries of being in the Eurozone. To your point about being an exporter, Germany's a huge net exporter to the rest of Europe. So the largest beneficiary in many respects of the Eurozone has been unable to articulate or unwilling to articulate to its national constituency the benefits of being in the Eurozone. So speak, to, if you will, to whether you're optimistic, pessimistic. What's a realistic way forward for a solution to Europe's banking problem?
I think you've got to start where you're pessimistic. The single currency cannot survive in its present form. It will have to be substantially, the euro will have to be substantially reformed to enable it to survive, because so many weaknesses have been found. It's got no crisis resolution mechanism. It doesn't have fiscal and monetary coordination. It therefore has been found wanting in the crisis. And therefore, people will have to make quite painful decisions about how they cooperate better together. And they will have to surrender some of their fiscal autonomy to be able to make the single currency work, or the single currency will fall apart. But you see, I think if I were honest, I would say that the German analysis of the problem at the moment is that this is primarily a debt problem. Therefore, it's Greek profligacy extending to the rest of Europe that is really what is wrong, according to their version. And that ignores the fact that German banks are actually in a difficult position, and it ignores the point you're making that if Germany is being successful at the expense of the rest of Europe, then it's draining the ability of these European economies to grow. So Germany has got to accept, I think, that it's not simply a debt problem, but a banking problem, a competitiveness problem, and a fiscal problem as well. France has got a different problem. So when President Sarkozy meets Chancellor Merkel, and unfortunately, I know them both and like them very much, but he comes with a different perspective. She's wanting to show it's a debt problem and not a banking problem. He knows that France has got a banking problem because they've got Dexia, they've got all these other banks that are very highly leveraged that are in difficulty at the moment. But he's worried that if he says we've got to restructure our banks, then France will lose its AAA rating, which is very important to a country to have that sovereign rating, as America showed when it reacted against the decision of one rating agency, which in my view was a terrible mistake by that rating agency, but nevertheless. But France is worried about losing its sovereign rating, and if it does lose its sovereign rating, then the cost of it paying for its debt will rise very substantially, and of course it could be in even greater problems economically and financially as a result. So Mrs. Merkel is reluctant to propose the sort of things that I'm suggesting because she is yet to be convinced it's more than a debt problem. And Mr. Sarkozy accepts that there is a banking problem because he knows he's got it in France. But if he admits publicly that this is a real problem that requires massive restructuring, then he will find it difficult in France because his country could lose its AAA rating. And therefore, you can see the pressures on politicians not to do certain things. I notice you praised me for not joining the euro. The pressure not to do certain things. But I think you've got to be able to triumph above that and say, look, if we don't act, what is then going to happen in Europe? Because we will have a Greek crisis, a Greek default probably, then it will spill all over into the banks who will be weakened further. Some of them may be insolvent. We may have to rescue these banks. Even then, if we do, we've still got to fund our borrowing, and we're not growing fast enough, and how we're going to get to grow again. So they've got to think through, I think, that here's a sequence of problems that is arisen because of their failure to act decisively earlier on. And if we wait further and don't act now, these problems could get even worse. So these are the calculations that people have got to take into account when they make the decisions. But there's no doubt that the European crisis is not just a European problem now, it is going to affect the rest of the world economy.
So if we dig a little deeper there, what you're saying is, as you said in your book, that all politics is local in the end, even if you've got a global or European problem. And I wonder if we can pick up on a theme that you alluded to towards the end of your remarks about the rise of emerging economies. So in many ways, the European problem resembles problems that we typically associate with places like Latin America, Southeast Asia in the late 1990s. The IMF in those situations has played the role often of, in some sense, giving governments cover to do things that they can't otherwise do. That's one interpretation of the IMF asking governments to make very difficult decisions. Is there a role for the IMF to play a similar role here in Europe, in your view?
It's funny, you know, that 75% of the funds of the International Monetary Fund are now being devoted to rescuing Europe. And you think of the International Monetary Fund as having responsibilities for Africa and Asia and Latin America, and its main activities are mainly in these areas. But now, because of the European crisis and the money that's gone into Greece and the money that's gone into Eastern Europe, nearly three quarters of the IMF's funds are being devoted to helping or assisting, with a great deal of conditionality, of course, to make sure they do the right things, Europe. Now, the question is, if you're going to get out of this problem, then I think my own view is you're going to have to recapitalize the banks in Europe, which is about 300 billion, probably a lot more if you were going to be even more radical in making sure that these banks were properly protected against the future. But then you've got to fund the borrowing of countries like Spain and Portugal and Greece and Italy and Ireland. And even if there's a default in Greece, there's still a problem about how you fund the existing borrowing. And that's probably about $2 trillion. I mean, that is a huge sum of money to guarantee that these countries are funded so that they can continue to function properly over the next, let's say, 3 years. So where do you get $2 trillion? When we held the IMF in London in April 2009, we had to underpin the world economy to give people the sense that we meant business by $1 trillion. So we had to announce that the IMF and the World Bank and other international agencies would have $1 trillion extra in funding, and we had to levy countries to raise that money, countries that weren't affected as well as those that were, and that happened in 2009. Now I'm suggesting in 2011, to get through this crisis, you don't need to spend this money, but you need to guarantee this money in some way, and you're talking about $2 trillion. Now, the IMF has only got about $250 billion in funds that are not allocated at the moment. So the IMF, it's far too big a job for even the IMF. The European Central Bank could put the money up because it can both print money and it can, at the same time, of course, gets its money from the issuing of currency anyway, the seigniorage, as they call it. But the ECB, the European Central Bank, will be reluctant to lay itself open as a monetary authority to putting such sums of money into the economy. The member states of the European Union can't raise $2 trillion without huge levies on these countries, which they've already said that it's going to be very difficult for them to fund. And their fund at the moment is only 400 billion euros, which is a bit more in dollars. So where does the money come from? I would suggest that if we're going to bring an end to this crisis, the best way of doing it would be for the European Central Bank to guarantee that it will fund the countries that are in difficulty, subject to the conditionality that has got to be very tough, and that the IMF will help provide the funds that are necessary to do so in the short term, with the condition that the European Union sorts out the euro within a year, and so that the restructuring of the euro that is necessary for it to be a successful currency takes place over a period of months, but it's got to happen within a year's time. The IMF would then have to raise its money from China or from the oil states, who would be prepared, I think, to lend the IMF money because of the difficulty that the world economy faces. So it's a complex solution, very similar to the 1970s and 1980s, but it would mean that Europe could get through this crisis, that the money would probably not have to be used because everybody would know that we had underpinned the markets and therefore, in a sense, stood up to the market pressures that exist on these countries, and then the euro would have to be reformed. And I think that's probably the only way that this will happen quickly. And therefore you do, in my view, need an international organization like the International Monetary Fund to help.
So if we gave you a wand, Gordon, and allowed you to wave it over this situation, and you could impose conditionalities, that is, tell the European countries to do A, B, and C, what would A, B, and C be, or maybe there's just an A? Or maybe
sort out your banks, which are clearly over-leveraged. Sort out the euro, because it clearly doesn't work at the moment. Make sure that you have a fiscal coordination, that is, that you can transfer money from one part of Europe to another if there is a crisis. Probably issue common euro bonds so that there is some guarantee that these bonds are, if you like, trustworthy, because they have the backing of Germany and France and countries that are central to the core of, at the core of Europe. And then get a growth strategy in place, because you cannot survive by continually having to cut and cut and cut. You need to get to growth at some point. And Europe has a particular problem of growth because of the problems that I've described. So you've got to make sure that Europe is in a position to export to the rest of the world. So I think you've got to do a number of things, but it's becoming more and more urgent that these things are done. And the success of Europe is, of course, and we shouldn't underestimate this, that Europe was a continent at war until 1945. It is a continent where these countries that used to be at war are now part of an economic union, which is a great step forward. Countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain were not democracies, but have been guaranteed as democracies by the membership of the European Union. Countries from Eastern Europe have managed to find their role as part of the new Europe, free of the Soviet Union. And these are huge and tremendous achievements, both for democracy and for prosperity. And millions of people have been taken out of poverty. But you do the cause of European unity a disservice if you create a mechanism that's not working and makes people want to retreat into their nationalist identities. And even, countries like Belgium are in danger of breaking up, so that you no longer have a Belgium at all and you have two separate countries as a result of the pressures that they're under. So you don't do the cause of European unity and peace and prosperity a service if you don't make the institutions that you're using to work. And that's really what the problem is at the moment. We've got to make the euro a currency that can actually work successfully to bring economic growth and a reduction in unemployment in Europe.
So let's broaden it out a bit and move to your global growth pact idea. You talked about emerging markets. You've talked about emerging markets potentially as playing a role in providing resources, ironically, to the IMF to allow the IMF to support Europe and what it needs to do. Global imbalances, more consumption in China, more savings in the United States, and so on. How would you bring this about? What would be the elements of this global growth pact? How would you actually incentivize the kind of behavior that you want to see?
Well, the International Monetary Fund did a study as to what could happen to the world economy if you had this coordination. And they found that by 2014, you'd have 4 or 5% higher growth. You'd have 25 to 50 million more jobs, including millions of jobs in Europe and America. and you take 100 million people out of poverty. So it has been shown that if you have this kind of agreement, it could work. So the question is, what is preventing it happening? You would have to persuade China. You see, at the moment, the big debate in America and Europe to some extent is the Chinese currency undervalued, and should it not be forced upwards? And are they manipulating their currency? And you can have a huge row over the next year or two where you say to China, you've got to revalue your currency, and China says, no, this is national sovereignty, we'll do what we want, we should decide what our currency is. And so you've got this standoff. And when the G20 met in Korea a few months ago, they tried to find a way out of that. That instead of having a currency agreement, they would have a trade surpluses agreement. So China would only have a surplus of 4% on its trade, and America only a deficit of 4% on its trade. But that discussion broke down, partly because there was a misunderstanding between China and America, and partly because it was a difficult thing to do. Perhaps the easiest way through this is to say, China, honor your promises that you're going to increase the numbers of people in your middle class and increase the numbers of people coming out of poverty, and allow people in China to spend more. Allow them to buy their homes, allow them, but also to buy consumer goods, allow them to buy goods coming into the country from other countries, and let's have an expansion of consumer demand in China. And if you have that expansion of consumer demand, then you're buying more exports from America and more exports from Europe as well as from the rest of the world, and you're getting the world economy moving again. And if that was the starting point, instead of pressuring China on its currency for the time being, or on its surpluses as against the rest of the world, go in a more direct way and say, look, what you need to do is do what you said you were going to do, which is increase consumer spending, give people more money in their pockets, make sure that people can get a bigger benefit out of being a successful industrial producer. Instead of putting so much money into investment, and instead of putting so much money into export promotion, put money into the pockets of your consumers. And then, of course, if that happened, America and Europe would grow faster, American consumers would be more secure in their jobs, and then you would have a self-reinforcing cycle of growth. It's basically the policies that should have been applied in the 1930s, applied at a global level and not just a national level.
And you spoke about confidence. It seems as though one of the things that's really missing at the moment in the world is confidence.
Yeah.
If you, for example, if you look at the United States, with the exception of the banks, which are continue to struggle, many corporations actually have record high levels of profits. There's an enormous amount of hoarding of corporate balance sheets. We see very little investment in real activity. Investment is at an all-time low in the United States, about 12% of GDP. What would you do, given the fiscal constraints? You could say the government could step in and start investing in infrastructure. And you alluded to infrastructure investment as part of your Global Growth Pact. How would you get investment restarted in your Global Growth Pact?
Well, see, why are companies not investing? If you're an American company at the moment, hoarding lots of funds to protect yourself against any potential crisis, why won't you invest? And the reason they're not investing, of course, is that in America, like in Europe, the consumer market is so weak that they can't see the huge returns from investing in new consumer products or investing in expanding retail or whatever. And so as long as people think the consumer market is depressed and that spending by consumers is going to be, if growing at all, growing very slowly, then the returns from investment look very low. But if, of course, America was benefiting from an export boost, and if it was able to bring profits back into the country, and if its exports were creating jobs for American workers producing these exports, and if its innovation was actually yielding big results because it was selling more apples or whatever to the rest of the world, then you would have this confidence coming back. So that's the key to it. As far as infrastructure is concerned, I actually think this is an interesting argument about whether in a period when interest rates are low and inflation is low, and you've got these huge infrastructure needs that can be met, instead of having to borrow at 10%, you can borrow at a limited amount of money and can solve some of these infrastructure problems. But you've got to make a distinction between consumer, if you like, between spending and investing. And you can justify, I think, borrowing for investment at this particular point in time, whereas you cannot justify the same argument for spending. And I think investment may be a different category in a period like this, where it would be worth, at a limited cost, expanding your infrastructure and therefore equipping yourself to meet the competition from Asia from the future. Now let's look 15 years from now. America is the biggest consumer market in the world at the moment. If you want to be selling goods, you want to sell them in America because it's the biggest consumer market in the world. But in 15 years' time, let's say 2025, the biggest consumer market in the world will be Asia. It will be 40% of world consumer spending, and America will be 20%. And Germany will be 4%, and Britain will be 3%, and Italy 3%. And so we'll be a declining share of consumer spending. So we have got to produce the products and services in Europe and America that are going to attract consumers in this vastly expanding middle class of Asia. And therefore, you should be investing now to equip yourself to meet these needs. And whether it's in research and development or in science and technology or in education, if you're going to succeed, you've got to be able to produce the value added, the technology driven, the custom built goods and services. And you've got to be ahead on technology and science if you're going to be able to do it. And if you're ahead now, you've got to keep ahead if you're going to be able to sell to these markets. So the infrastructure investment is partly about equipping ourselves to meet that new challenge of the future.
Mr. Brown, thank you for your talk. I have two questions. First, you said you admitted that there is a growing belief in Europe that European currency, euro itself, is going to fail. And European Union, probably in the future, some people believe, is going to fail as well. Do you think that the current government of the United Kingdom, David Cameron's government, possesses potential, some qualities that probably your government didn't have when you were in power, that could solve the crisis, both for the UK and for the European integration? And the second question, if European currency, euro itself, does fail, it could happen in the future. If European countries lose their faith in euro and the union itself does disassemble, is it the end of story for Europe? Or is it a new beginning? That probably this kind of union and the conditions on which it is based right now, it should fail so that in the future we could build a better union. Thank you.
I don't think if the euro or the European Union fail, you can succeed very quickly in building something similar but better in the future. So I don't think out of the disintegration of the European Union or the euro could you actually build better cooperation quickly. I think it would be a huge defeat for those people who want to see greater cooperation across Europe and even greater global cooperation. What I said was, and I really don't want to comment on our country's government in Britain. I don't want to get involved in criticising our country's government when I'm out of the country. But I think what I was saying was that the euro cannot survive in its present form. That doesn't mean to say the euro can't survive, but it has to be a different kind of euro. It's got to be a euro where you've got proper support built in to deal with crises, where you've reformed the, if you like, the fiscal arrangements, where you've done some of the things that America has taught us you can do to make a single currency work, greater flexibility, greater support from the center. You deal with these things, and therefore the euro can actually be restructured. And I think the reason I'm suggesting give them a year to do it is this is complex. It requires 27 countries in the European Union to change the European Union, 17 countries in the euro to change the euro. So it will take time to deliver that. So I'm not being defeatist in saying I don't think the euro can be reformed. I think it can be. I think it will take time. I think it's necessary to do so. But I think the whole world will pay a price if the euro and the European Union fails. And I think it's only now that you can see that the effect that the American financial crash had on the rest of the world in 2008 was disastrous, because output plunged in China and in the rest of Asia. Poverty rose dramatically in Africa, and as a result of that crisis, a lot of people lost their jobs in countries way beyond America. And the same problem really arises if Europe fails and you've got a freezing of markets in Europe, then it will affect the rest of the world. So there's an urgency on the part of the rest of the world to support action that can make sure that the European Union can work and solve this problem. So I actually think that that we had the right approach, that you've got to cooperate globally. I don't think you can just sit it out and say it's nothing to do with us, it's someone else's problem. I think you've really got to work at it in cooperation with your partners.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Ambassador of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was in 2000-2004 in UK, and I was a big fan of yours. And I believe that UK is AAA still because of what you did. Now to this lecture. Would you agree with me to say that there is this balance of economic power in the worldwide, like it was before the World War I and World War II, and that the cooperation that you're talking about is probably the only solution? Should we put, so to say, bricks and pigs together and find a possibility for Europe and America for their own chance? And at last, your premiership and your millennium goals tell me that maybe it is a little bit premature to believe in economic morality. Thank you.
You know, I'm very grateful for what you said, and I'm glad you enjoyed your period in the United Kingdom between 2000 and 2004, and it's very good to be hearing from you now. I actually think people's reaction to the banking crisis was they wondered why it was that when the values they hold in everyday life to be important, that you've got to be responsible in your actions in relation to your friends and your family, in relation to the people you know and have to deal with, and you've got to treat them fairly. And if you're a small business and operating with customers that are directly in association with you, you've got to be fair and responsible in the way you treat them. And they started to ask why it was that our financial institutions almost lived in a different world, where they could act in a way that was irresponsible and reckless and not have to pay a penalty, and could act in a way that was completely unfair, and yet people had to accept that. And I think actually there's been a change in the way that people see the financial system, and therefore there is a sense that the market should be free, but it shouldn't be value free, and that it's got to operate to principles that at least give the same weight and emphasis to acting responsibly as fairly as you do to acting with enterprise and dynamism and with energy and freedom. So I think there has been a change in the way people see markets and see financial institutions. And I think people are more willing to accept the argument that these global financial institutions shouldn't act in a way that is completely different from the way that I expect you to act in relation to me if I meet you, or my family, or my friends, or even the small businesses I'm in touch with. The question, however, is have we capitalized on people's sense that things should be different to create better financial institutions? And I think that's where we've fallen and haven't managed to achieve enough. We know that they ought to be operating in a more transparent and accountable way. We know that if you don't have global financial standards, then the good countries are going to be undercut by the bad, and the bad by the worst, and you're going to have a race to the bottom. But we've yet to find the coherence in our approach internationally to deliver on what we believe, I think, to be true, that markets do need morals, And when you talk about the Millennium Development Goals, that you've got to see the purpose of economic policy is not simply making profits, but actually delivering goals that are in the interests of the whole community, such as relieving poverty, helping people get jobs, making sure that children have education so that they're able to equip themselves for their working lives. So I think we have learned something from the crisis. I just don't think we've been able yet to apply it properly. So we're still at risk of being brought down by financial institutions, even if it's this time in Europe rather than in America. And we're still at risk of further financial crisis coming out of other financial centers where we don't really still know, we don't yet know what's happening to the flow of finance, or alternatively what, we don't have a crisis prevention strategy for if things go wrong. We don't know what to do yet because we haven't agreed measures to deal with crises. So I sort of disagree with your final point. I think people are aware that there are moral issues here, and people do think that people should have responsibility in the way they operate in the financial markets as well as in everyday life. But we still haven't got agreement on how we apply these lessons to make the financial system work in a more accountable and acceptable way.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. My question is, do you think Europe at any time, like in the future, would be forced to use military coercion against those countries who are not willing to cooperate, and also to open market in countries which are weak militarily and infrastructurally weak? My second question is, the current unrest in the Arab world has created a massive opportunity for Dubai, and for United Arab Emirates in general. Do you think there will be any opportunity for Europe from this unrest? Thank you.
I don't think military action would be justifiable under any circumstances in relation to what the problems that we're talking about, and I don't think that's going to happen. So I would rule out that as even a subject for consideration. I do, however, think your second point is something that is really very important. We've got perhaps 80 million young people unemployed around the world. A very large proportion of them are in this region. I was talking to the governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia only the other day because I'm interested in what they're trying to do to help young people who are unemployed, and they've got 40% youth unemployment. Egypt's got 40%. Saudi Arabia's got 30%. You've got a large number of young people in this region who need opportunity, and for whom, not in this country and not in some other countries, unemployment is high because it's low here, but for whom there seems very little chance of jobs unless something changes quite dramatically. And therefore, I would favor a Middle East Development Bank that was charged with building cross-border infrastructure, but also helping young people get opportunities. And I think if you've got a Latin American Development Bank and an Asian Development Bank and an African Development Bank and a European Reconstruction and Development Bank, the case here for using some of the oil money to fund a bank that would be in a position to lend to entrepreneurial projects, but also to help young people get jobs is very, very strong indeed. Now, it's urgent as well, because you've had change in Egypt and in Tunisia, but if young people and others don't see that change is bringing economic benefits, and it hasn't yet brought any economic benefits, their discontent will not be removed. And so you can have a change of regime, but if it doesn't make a difference to people's economic circumstances, I think you'll still have discontent. So I think the importance of recognizing what's happening in this region and how it can contribute to general economic growth around the world, but I suspect it's by mobilizing some of the oil wealth within the region to support some of those areas of the region where unemployment is very high. And I hope that there will be some consideration of that in future months.
Thank you very much. My name is Mastawal. I'm a first-year student from NYU Abu Dhabi. So first I have to say that it's a great pleasure to have you around campus today and also to have your invaluable presence in our university. So my question goes back to the urgent Eurozone crisis. So with the turn of events in Europe to resolve the Greek debt crisis, there's a speculation that if Greece is finally met to default on its state, that it would have a particular effect on emerging markets. So would you agree with this speculation, and would emerging markets be impacted more heavily than any other market? Thank you.
You know, one of the things you learn when you've been in the job that I was in is that it's very dangerous to speculate about certain things. And sometimes when people speculate in public, it causes a lot of grief. I would only say that the markets are now pricing in, and therefore expect there to be a default in Greece at some point. But I think that Greece is only one of the issues now in Europe, and therefore it's almost as if we didn't solve the Greek problem 2 years ago and a year ago when we should have solved it. It is a very small part of the European economy and is causing a huge amount of difficulty, but it is not the only problem that has got to be dealt with, and therefore the effect on emerging markets, which is what you have raised, is less likely to come from what happens to Greece and more likely to come from the ramifications of the other things that are happening in Europe across the region and then across the rest of the world. Now there's this view, as you know, that Asia or other parts of the world are decoupling themselves from Europe and America. And some people say that although the financial crisis bit very hard into Asia and this region and Africa initially, that they were far more resilient than people would have expected. And their recovery from the crisis has been far quicker, of course, than the recovery in America and Europe. So some people want to talk about a decoupling. So the world is now, if you like, breaking down into units that are more self-sufficient and not mutually dependent on each other. I don't happen to think that is correct. And I think it used to be said for every 1% additional growth in America, it meant that there was 5% additional growth in exports in China. Such was the mutual dependence of these countries. And I think there is still a high degree of mutual dependence, and therefore the emerging markets are affected by what happens in Europe as a whole. What happens in Europe affects America, and of course what happens in America affects the rest of the world. So we're still in a mutually dependent world. I don't think that will change dramatically over the next few years, and we're all affected by what happens if something goes wrong in one country. And yes, you're right, it's not that the emerging markets will stop growing, it's that the rate of growth will stop to be sufficiently high for them to meet the employment needs of the population and for them to be able to take large numbers of people out of poverty. And that would be a great loss to the world over the next few years.
Good to see you both since London in June. Very quick question. Some people would argue that the euro is more of a political union versus an economic union. I want to get your comments on that. And secondly, you talked about in your book that global problems require global solutions. What institution do you see acting in that capacity? And how would you incorporate the players that are part of the shadow banking system?
Maybe the next question, quickly, and then Gordon will take them all at once.
To my eye, many of these problems, which continue to seem to snowball, stem from a lack of or a misallocation of resources and risk, very much supported by what I'd call moral hazard and government's ability and central banks' efforts to backstop misallocation of resources and a lack of underlying entities to take their hits. And I'm curious to what you'd have to say towards that. One, two, another comment, what about governments that we can't afford anymore? And the ability of governments at this point in time to continue to borrow money when we don't have the resources to support the efforts that governments are paying for at this point.
Let's pause there and give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, I'll be a short answer, but difficult. Oh, so you want me to respond? I thought you were going to take the
no,
third
go ahead.
question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's a political decision to form a European Economic Union. So there's no doubt it was a political decision. And then it had to be backed up by economic action to make it happen. And it was basically a deal that was done between President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl of Germany. And in return for support for German unification, Mitterrand wanted to see the union of Europe, and this is what happened. So it was a political decision. You've got to make it work economically, but you've got to do the right things to make it work economically. There's no reason why, in principle, a single currency can't work. You've just got to do the right things, and it takes a lot of time. Who's going to do the monitoring of financial standards and take it? You really got to rely on the IMF to do a bigger and probably enhanced job in the future, backed up by the Bank of International Settlements and the Global Stability Board. But these are the institutions that you ought to be able to rely on to do more to make the world economy work better. I think we're venturing into this deficit and stimulus argument, aren't we? When you talk about the real problem being the excessive levels of government spending. I personally don't think that's the major reason why we've got the problems we've got. I think that this started as a crisis in the private sector, in the financial system. And I think if we forget that, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. And I do feel myself that the banking and financial system is in need of reform. And I'm pro-market and pro-enterprise and pro-competition and pro-business, and always have been. But I do believe that we've got to make sure that our markets work in the public interest. And so I would say the root of the problem is not government spending. We can have an argument about that and a debate about that, but if we forget that this problem started as a financial crisis that has to be resolved, and is now also in Europe a financial crisis that is about the banking system, then we will do ourselves a disservice. So I'm all for having an argument about the level or the quantity of government spending, and we can have that argument, but let's not forget the source of this financial crisis.
So here we are in Abu Dhabi, Global Network University, something that's never been done before. You've painted a vision for global cooperation, a world of prosperity led by emerging market growth. In many ways, the Global Network University represents the kind of cooperation, the kind of, if I will, humility of extending to the rest of the world kind of a metaphorical hand, saying we want to be part of the solution, we want to think together with you. My question for you is the following: is the developed world ready to play a more humble role, to be led, if you will, as you painted? Because in your vision, it really is the emerging markets leading the way. Is the developed world ready to let the emerging markets play that bigger role? And what gives you the confidence that the leadership is there to allow that, to make that to happen?
Maybe I said this in London when I was speaking in July, but I just repeat this. Look back to the John Kennedy, the President of America, in 1960, 1961, and the vision that he tried to present about the future of the world that had gone beyond the Cold War. And it wasn't a vision of American arrogance or supremacy or hegemony. It was about what he then called a declaration of interdependence. So I don't know if you look, last year I was asked to contribute to this compilation, which was the re-recording of that famous Kennedy inaugural address, which he gave in 1961 in January, which was republished, but on this occasion, individuals from each continent read one line of that Kennedy inaugural address. And many of you will know from the history that there was some, the torch is passed to a new generation. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Never negotiate from fear, never fear to negotiate. All these great historic lines that are quite memorable. And some of you may know that Richard Nixon, who was the defeated candidate in the 1960 presidential election, was asked, which of the memorable lines from the Kennedy inaugural address would you like to have said yourself? And he said, there's only one line I would like to have said: I hereby accept the office of President of the United States of America. But I was asked to read one line, which is quite different from that and not as memorable, but it actually summed up, I think, a vision of America, and indeed Europe and America, as part of an international community. And it was about divided, we shall surely fail. United, and then it went on to say, it is within our mortal power to end poverty, hunger, disease, and war. And then Kennedy went on, and after that inaugural address, he gave a speech in Philadelphia to commemorate the Declaration of Independence, and he called that speech the Declaration of Interdependence. So I think that is a humility about our dependence upon each other, rather than the supremacy of one over the other. It's a bit like the George Marshall speech that he gave in 1948 with the Marshall Plan. You know, our enemy is not one country or one ideology. Our enemy is hunger, disease, poverty, injustice, and so on. And I think that's really the vision of an interdependent world where we're better capable of solving problems by working together. And if at times it has seemed like unilateral attempts at imposing a hegemony on the world, I don't think at its best America or indeed Europe in the past have had a vision of a world that is other than one where that interdependence is backed up by proper international institutions that can work more effectively than the institutions that work at the moment. So at the same time as you're building a global society through the Global Network University, and at the same time as people are able to do something that you could never do, which is quite revolutionary, communicate with each other instantaneously across the world, which we can do through the internet, and therefore making possible a whole series of associations across religions, across ideologies, across borders, we should also think about how we can build better global institutions that reflect that interdependence. And if we are truly dependent on each other for our welfare and for our progress, then it's not really an option as to whether we build these better global institutions, it's a necessity. And I think, again, this Global Network University has got a role to play in popularizing the idea that we do better when we work together, and that you can actually build a world that is based on and founded on greater cooperation and a spirit of cooperation such as that exhibited by Kennedy in his inaugural address. So I would be optimistic about the future.
Great.
Thank you.